In our previous episodes, we established the foundational tension between India and China. Today, we focus on the McMahon Line, a 890-kilometer boundary that has served as the central point of contention since the 1914 Simla Conference. The McMahon Line is more than a map marking. It is the physical manifestation of a century-old diplomatic dispute that continues to dictate the security posture of two nuclear-armed nations in the high Himalayas today. Following the 1914 Simla Convention, the immediate aftermath saw a period of administrative ambiguity where the line remained largely unpatrolled, setting the stage for decades of conflicting territorial claims and eventual military escalation in the region. While Sir Henry McMahon received recognition for his cartographic work, the Chinese government officially rejected the treaty, arguing that their representative, Ivan Chen, lacked the authority to finalize the border without explicit approval from the Beijing government. The impact of this diplomatic failure was profound, as it left the eastern sector of the Himalayan border without a mutually accepted demarcation, ultimately forcing both nations to rely on unilateral interpretations of colonial-era maps during crises. For the local Monpa tribes residing in the Tawang Tract, the border dispute created a complex reality where their cultural and religious allegiance to Lhasa often clashed with the expanding administrative presence of British and later Indian authorities. This map illustrates the 890-kilometer stretch from the Bhutanese border to the Isu Razi Pass, highlighting the strategic watershed crests that Sir Henry McMahon utilized to define the border against the Tibetan Plateau's southern edge. Today, the legacy of the McMahon Line is preserved in the Survey of India's official records, which treat the boundary as an immutable fact, while Chinese archives categorize it as an illegal colonial relic of the British Raj. A lesser-known fact is that the McMahon Line was not even published on official Survey of India maps until 1937, more than 2 decades after the Simla Conference, due to internal British concerns regarding the treaty's legal status. Compared to the western sector of the border, where the terrain is largely barren and high altitude, the eastern McMahon Line sector is characterized by deep river valleys and dense forests, creating unique logistical challenges for military deployment. Modern remembrance of the line is dominated by the Tawang Monastery, founded in 1681, which remains a focal point for Indian claims of historical administrative reach, countering Chinese assertions that the region is part of South Tibet. The unit legacy of the Assam Rifles, who were tasked with patrolling the remote border tracts post-independence, remains a cornerstone of Indian military history in the region, reflecting the transition from colonial administration to national sovereignty. Key timeline dates include the 1950 arrival of PRC forces in Tibet, which triggered India's formal reaffirmation of the McMahon Line, and the 1959 Lonchen incident, which served as a precursor to the massive 1962 military offensive. The story of the McMahon Line inspires modern geopolitical students by demonstrating how colonial-era cartography and diplomatic ambiguity can create long-term security dilemmas that persist despite decades of bilateral negotiations and peace treaties between major powers. The fundamental lesson from this history is that borders defined without the explicit, ratified consent of all involved parties are prone to recurring disputes, especially when those lines intersect with shifting regional power dynamics and nationalistic claims. As we conclude this 10th installment of our series, the McMahon Line stands as a testament to the unresolved nature of the India-China border, serving as a reminder that the past is never truly settled in the Himalayas. Ultimately, the McMahon Line remains a silent witness to the evolving relationship between India and China, waiting for a diplomatic resolution that has eluded both nations for over a century of complex and often volatile interactions. This analysis is grounded in the documented records of the Simla Convention and subsequent diplomatic archives, ensuring a factual account of the events that shaped the eastern sector of the India-China border over the last 100 years. The Simla Convention of 1914 was intended to create a tripartite agreement, but the Chinese refusal to ratify the final treaty effectively rendered the McMahon Line a bilateral understanding between the British and the Tibetan government alone. Lonchen Shatra, the Tibetan plenipotentiary, played a critical role in these negotiations, as his willingness to accept the watershed boundary was essential for British India's strategic goal of creating a buffer zone against potential northern encroachment. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs consistently argues that Tibet lacked the sovereign authority to enter into international treaties, a position that forms the core of their rejection of the McMahon Line as a valid legal instrument. Geographically, the McMahon Line follows the highest watershed of the Himalayas, which provides a natural and defensible barrier that India has consistently cited as the primary evidence for the line's legitimacy as a scientific border. Arunachal Pradesh, which encompasses the vast majority of the territory south of the McMahon Line, covers an area of approximately 83,743 square kilometers, making it a significant strategic asset for India in the eastern Himalayan region. The 1962 Sino-Indian War saw significant casualties, with approximately 1,383 Indian soldiers killed and 3,968 captured, while Chinese forces reported 722 killed and 1,697 wounded during the intense fighting across the McMahon Line sector. Following the November 1962 unilateral ceasefire, Chinese forces withdrew to the line of actual control, a move that left the exact location of the border ambiguous and created the current environment of frequent, localized military standoffs. The Sumdorong Chu standoff in 1987 serves as a critical historical marker, as it brought both nations to the brink of a major conflict near the McMahon Line, necessitating the first significant border peace agreements in the 1990s. Yangtze, located in the Tawang sector, has become a focus of modern friction, with frequent skirmishes between Indian and Chinese patrols highlighting the continued lack of a mutually agreed-upon border demarcation on the ground today. The Panchsheel Agreement of 1954, which outlined the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, was a missed opportunity to definitively resolve the border dispute, as both nations chose to prioritize diplomatic relations over addressing the territorial disagreement. The Brahmaputra and Siang river basins are vital to the region's geography, as they provide essential water resources and create deep valleys that dictate the movement of troops and the placement of strategic infrastructure along the border. Simla Pass, at an elevation of over 4,000 meters, is a critical point in the Tawang sector, serving as a gateway that has been heavily fortified by India to prevent any potential incursions from the northern side. The 1993 and 1996 Border Peace and Tranquility Agreements established a framework for managing the LAC, yet these agreements have struggled to prevent the increasing frequency of patrols and infrastructure development by both sides in recent years. Infrastructure development, including new tunnels like the Simla Tunnel, is dramatically changing the tactical landscape of the Tawang sector, allowing for all-weather connectivity that was previously impossible due to the region's harsh winter conditions. China's claim of South Tibet for the Tawang region is rooted in historical cultural ties, which Beijing uses to challenge the legitimacy of the McMahon Line and assert its sovereignty over the territory south of the watershed. India's official position remains that Arunachal Pradesh is an integral part of its sovereign territory, and the McMahon Line serves as the only legal and historical boundary that defines the limits of Indian administration in the east. The total disputed border between India and China spans roughly 3,488 kilometers, with the McMahon Line representing the eastern sector, which remains the most clearly defined on paper but the most contested in terms of political recognition. Historical records from the Tawang Monastery indicate that the region maintained administrative links with Lhasa for centuries, a fact that China utilizes to argue that the McMahon Line arbitrarily severed these long-standing cultural and religious ties. The 1962 war not only changed the military landscape but also fundamentally altered the diplomatic relationship between New Delhi and Beijing, ending the era of Hindi Chini bye-bye and ushering in a period of long-term strategic mistrust. Modern satellite imagery reveals a rapid expansion of dual-use infrastructure on both sides of the McMahon Line, including new airfields and roads that are designed to facilitate rapid troop mobilization during any potential border crisis. The elevation of the McMahon Line ranges from 2,000 meters in the lower river valleys to over 6,000 meters at the highest watershed peaks, creating a vertical battlefield that requires specialized high-altitude training for all deployed forces. Despite the absence of formal archaeological excavations defining the border, the historical presence of Buddhist monasteries serves as a cultural marker that both India and China interpret to support their respective claims of regional historical influence. The 1914 Simla Conference also addressed the division of Tibet into inner and outer zones, a complex diplomatic arrangement that was intended to balance Chinese influence with Tibetan autonomy, but ultimately failed to satisfy any of the parties. The flight of the Dalai Lama to India in 1959 was a pivotal moment that exacerbated border tensions, as it directly challenged the PRC's control over Tibet and deepened the ideological divide between New Delhi and Beijing. The McMahon Line status as a de facto border means that while it is not formally recognized by China, it serves as the practical limit of Indian administrative control, a reality that both nations manage through constant, tense patrolling. The lack of a mutually agreed-upon line of actual control continues to cause tactical friction, as both sides often hold different perceptions of where the line lies, leading to frequent patrolling overlaps in the most sensitive sectors. Strategic analysts often point to the McMahon Line as a classic example of how colonial-era border delineations can become frozen conflicts, where the lack of a final settlement keeps the region in a state of perpetual, low-level mobilization. The role of the Monpa people in the Tawang region has been increasingly emphasized by India to demonstrate the integration of local populations into the national fabric, countering Chinese narratives of the region as a contested territory. China's continued refusal to recognize the McMahon Line is often linked to its broader strategy of maintaining flexibility in its border negotiations, allowing it to apply pressure on India whenever geopolitical conditions shift in its favor. The 1962 war serves as a cautionary tale for both nations, illustrating the high human and political costs of allowing border disputes to escalate into full-scale military conflict without adequate diplomatic communication or crisis management mechanisms. The McMahon Line's existence as a watershed boundary is technically sound from a geographical perspective, yet its political legitimacy remains the primary hurdle for any future, comprehensive border settlement between the two Asian giants. The ongoing militarization of the eastern border is a direct response to the unresolved nature of the McMahon Line, as both India and China seek to ensure their strategic interests are protected in a region of high geopolitical importance. The complexity of the McMahon Line dispute highlights the limitations of international law when applied to historical borders that were negotiated in a different era, with different power structures and vastly different regional political realities. The Tawang Tract's strategic location, overlooking the plains of Assam, makes it a vital point of interest for both nations, ensuring that any future border negotiations will inevitably focus on the status of this specific, highly contested area. The history of the McMahon Line is a story of missed opportunities and divergent interpretations, where the failure to reconcile colonial-era treaties with modern national sovereignty has created a lasting legacy of instability in the Himalayan region. As we look to the future, the McMahon Line will likely remain a central pillar of the India-China relationship, serving as a constant reminder of the unfinished business that continues to influence the geopolitical landscape of modern Asia. The study of the McMahon Line is essential for anyone seeking to understand the dynamics of the India-China border dispute, as it provides the necessary historical and legal context for the modern-day challenges faced by both nations. Through this investigation of the McMahon Line, we have uncovered the deep-seated historical and strategic reasons why this boundary remains the most significant, yet unresolved, fault line in the complex relationship between India and China today.